Hi everyone, and welcome back to the great mini rebuild. I think this is actually part 4. We've been away for a few weeks visiting family, so I apologise for the lack of progress, but we're getting back to it now, and we've entered that part of the build that I don't think anyone really likes, and that's fixing all the rusty holes. There's lots of them in this car, not as bad as the MG was, but it's still pretty bad. So I've bought lots of repair and other pieces. Tried to get heritage parts where I can because I found the metalwork is just superior to the clone stuff, but I haven't always been able to get that. But I'm starting with the boot. I'm going to put the new floor pan or the new boot pan in, and then I'm going to do the sides one by one. So I'll work right down the right side and then right down the left side, and then I'll go around and patch all the little pieces. So if you want to see what a truly awful looking panel is, take a look at this one. This is the inner front A panel, I think you call them. Um, and it's a shocker. I mean, I know it's not seen and it's covered by the outer A panel, but that's crap. Anyway, took a lot of fixing to actually try and get that to fit. But we've wangled it in and it doesn't look so bad once it's installed and I've flattened it out a bit. So after a lot of cursing, swearing, bashing, measuring, fitting the subframe, taking it out, fitting the subframe again, taking it out again, I finally got the boot floor component installed, and I've measured it all up with some of the measurements that I found on the net, and it seems to be as square as I'm probably going to get it. So we'll call that bit done and we'll move on to the sills. So the sills on this car are both pretty bad. As you can see from this photo. Um, However, for onward and forward, um, I haven't. I'm not planning at this stage to replace the floor, even though it's pretty. It's had a hard life. It's full of dents and bumps, which I've managed to beat most of them out. It's actually very solid, so I think the floor's been done sometime in the past, but there's no rust in it, which I'm just hoping I can beat all the dents and bumps and hollows out of it, and it looks respectable once it's painted up in body undercoat. Anyway, so we cut the sills off with the angle grinder and then spent probably the best part of the day drilling out all the spot welds and pulling the panels off. So there were a few spots where the inner sill to floor pan area had rusted, and particularly near the back corner here and up near the front corner. So rather than replace the whole inner sill area there, I've created a couple of repair pieces, and while these pictures are done before I finish grinding and making it look pretty, they're solid and they've fixed all those rusty spots that needed to be fixed before we can put the sill back on. So before we can put the sill back on, we needed to locate the two lifting brackets at the front and the back and the jacking point in the middle here. They're actually tricky to work out exactly where to put them because you put the sill over and they have to put a bolt through the sill, and it's not exactly easy to sort of hold it in place while you put the bolt through and take the sill back off. Anyway, we managed to do that, got them welded in place. Yeah, I also found that the rear subframe mounting brackets where the bolts go through in the heel board were really shocking as well. They were very badly corroded. So I've made up some new ones because I couldn't get any at the time. So I turned up a couple of big nuts and captive nuts and welded them on some plate and then welded the plates on. Not perhaps the prettiest piece of work you've ever seen in your life, but it's very solid. It won't be coming off in a hurry. So the next task is to actually put the new sill on. So I prepped the new sill up and punched some holes in it where it goes onto the floor plan so we could do some puddle welds, and then I was able to use my brand new spot welder which I bought just for this task to do the seam along the bottom of the door sill there. And I tell you, the spot welders probably makes your job of doing those things so much better. Not the easiest thing to master, but if you get clean surfaces and the clean join between the pieces, and then get the time and temperature right, they give you a good solid join. Well worth it. So now we're moving down along the right hand side towards the front, and In this picture here, we've ripped off the entire A panel and the inner A panel and exposed a little bit of damage. So we've got to repair that before we can put the new A panel pieces in. So we've cut up a few pieces, welded them in, spot welded them in place. Um, some pretty big gaps in this bit, but actually had to push that other outside piece back in because it's in the wrong place where it shows in that photo, but it came up quite well once it was done. I know some of these welds and joints don't necessarily look really pretty, but I tend to not like to grind them into oblivion and make it all too thin, especially when you can't actually see these. So I tend to grind the tops off, make sure that the weld itself is solid, uh, and then leave them the way they are rather than try to grind them completely flat, especially when they're going to be covered up anyway. So the next part is actually pretty tricky, and to be honest, this is the bit I was worried about the most because I was worried about getting the door gap right. So this is the A panel, I think they call it. There's two panels. There's an inner and an outer one, and the door hinges mount through them both, and so it's critical to have it in the right place in order to get the gap correct to the door. It's also tricky because to weld on the outer one, you actually have to sort of split the seam on the door jamb and then weld it down the edge. So you've got to weld that one and then grind it back so it looks pretty good. So it usually means welding on both the inside and the outside if you can to try and get it, thick enough and make it strong. I fitted the door in place and put the hinges on and lined it all up with some spacers and got the gap looking pretty good. So with that outer panel welded in place, I was able to then go down that whole seam, weld it up, grind it back. Then it's double check the door gap and finish welding it in place. So I'm not 100% sure this is the right way to do this, but I fitted the outer panel first because it's the one you see and it's critical to getting the door gap correct and the seams lined up in the body. The inner sill isn't so critical in my mind because it really just covers up the gap. While it gives a lot of strength, it's not cosmetic, it's structural. So this is the inner panel. It's that really shocking piece of metal forming that you saw earlier. So I had to beat this into shape to actually get it to fit neatly behind the outer panel and make sure all the bolt holes and everything lined up, and then it pressed flat against the body so you could actually weld it in place. So I used a couple of big pieces of iron to line up where the bolt holes go through and then pull the two pieces together. So with them pulled tightly together, I was then able to use the spot welder around that seam and then inside the guard able to weld it up against the body. And from the inside, it actually looks half decent now. So with the A panel part done, it's moving forward a little bit more. There was this little corner on the scuttle, I think they call it, that was rusty. The other side's fine, but this side's a bit of a mess. So I had a little repair panel which I've fitted and welded in place. Once again, not a good panel, this one, but a bit of, what do they call it, fendangling, fettling, got it into place. And in the meantime, my pile of excised rusty metal grows ever bigger. With that little repair piece done on the scuttle there, it's moving forward onto the inner wings of the engine bay. The whole top lip of this, which is where the bonnet sits down into, was completely rusted all the way along. So I made a new right angled section, cut the old piece right off and welded the whole new angled piece on from essentially the scuttle right round to the grill section. Did it in two pieces because getting the radius or the bend right at the front was not easy, but we did manage to get it in, and post grinding and things, it doesn't look too bad. This was the side where I'm replacing the whole guard. So to get the guard to fit, it's pretty tricky. There's about 5 areas of contact and you can see them all. There's the seam that goes along where the A panel matches. There's the join that goes to the new scuttle piece, and then the large lot that goes down into that groove along the inner wing that we just repaired. And then worst of all, there's the one where it matches with the, I'd call it the front fascia piece, I guess. The guard had originally been brazed onto the front fascia piece all the way along, and as a result of both the brazing and the efforts to remove the guard afterwards, that whole front fascia curve was a disaster. So what I did was cut a thin strip of metal and I formed it to the guard itself, and then I cut the front panel and welded it in place along the top of the front panel so it would match the curve of the guard. Here's before I dressed it and got it looking pretty. Once it was dressed and I fitted the guard back in place, you can see that the actual curve now matches the guard pretty well. In the end, I think I managed to get quite an acceptable curve and join here. So now that it's all welded on the inside and in place, you can see that the curves match and it looks reasonably good. So I think that will actually do. So with that now done, it's time to put the guard in its final place. So we fitted it in, positioned it, put a few Tek screws through it, hold it in place, and then welded it where it needs to go. With that done, it's most of the major stuff on the right-hand side done. I still have to go back over some of the joins and dressing with a hammer and dolly and perhaps a bit of spot welding here or welding here and there to dress up a few little holes, but we'll do that later. With all that done, I thought it's time to treat myself to something a little more fun to do, so I thought I'd finish putting the gearbox together. So you saw all the nice clean bits that I'd done previously, and a few of the bits that I was waiting for the gearbox finally came in, specifically the selector forks, and believe it or not, one tiny little keyway that took forever, or one Woodruff key that took forever to arrive. But arrive it did, and that's all the parts I was waiting for now in order to assemble the gearbox. So next week we should probably finish assembling the gearbox and we'll start on the left-hand side of the car. So that's a wrap for this week. Thank you all for watching. I hope I haven't bored you to tears too much. Bye and see you next week.